An elderly black man stood quietly at the edge of the chaos, his sharp eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before him. Robert Wilson, 72, had seen a lot in his years, but this moment stirred something deep within him. Across the street, SWAT officers in tactical gear buzzed with urgency, preparing to storm an apartment where a gunman was holding 3 hostages. Yellow tape blocked off the area, and officers barked orders while adjusting their equipment. Robert stood behind the tape, unnoticed by most, though one young officer finally spotted him. The officer approached, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Hey, Grandpa, I think you're lost," the officer called out mockingly. "The nursing home's on the other side of town." Laughter erupted among other officers, their jokes cutting through the heavy tension. Robert, unfazed, stared at the apartment building with the same calm intensity. "Sir, this is a restricted area. I need you to step back," another officer said, eyeing Robert with impatience. "I live here," Robert said, pointing to a window on the second floor. The officer raised an eyebrow and snorted. "Yeah, sure, and I'm the president. Now move along before we make you move." Robert took a step back, adjusting his well-worn cap. He'd been here before, dismissed, ridiculed, ignored, all because of his age and the color of his skin. He had watched other white residents of the building speak freely with the officers, their words taken at face value. But when it came to him, suspicion and scorn were all he ever received. The SWAT commander, Captain Richards, stood nearby, poring over blueprints of the buildings spread across the hood of a patrol car. Every few minutes he barked into his radio, frustration creeping into his voice. 3 hours had passed with no progress. The suspect hadn't responded to negotiations, and tensions hung thick in the air. "Delta team in position," crackled a voice over the radio. "Ready to breach in 60 seconds. Robert's eyes narrowed as he watched the SWAT team take their final positions. Something wasn't right. He could see it. The angles, the lack of proper cover, the gaps in their approach. His gut told him this plan was doomed. "This is going to go sideways," he muttered under his breath. Robert's mind raced back to the past few weeks. He remembered seeing a strange man sneaking into the building during odd hours, lingering in the hallways. He'd even reported the man to security, but his warnings had been brushed off as paranoia. Then there was the chemical smell he'd noticed coming from apartment 42. Again, no one had listened. Now, everything he had feared was coming to a head, and he couldn't stand by any longer. Before anyone could stop him, Robert ducked under the police tape and strode toward the officers. His sudden movement stunned the team, and 2 officers rushed to intercept him. "Hey, stop right there!" one shouted as they grabbed his arms. "What do you think you're doing, old man?" another snapped. Captain Richards stormed over, his face a mix of irritation and disbelief. "What's going on here? Get him out of here!" Robert, calm despite the chaos, locked eyes with Richards. "If you go in there like this, people are going to die," he said firmly. Richards scoffed. "And you're some kind of expert? Do you know how many operations I've led? Stay out of this." Robert didn't even blink. "I've known that building for 40 years. Helped build it, actually. There's a hidden passage between apartments 402 and 404. It's not on the blueprints. If you go in through the front, you're walking right into a trap." The captain paused, his annoyance fading into something more uncertain. The officers around him shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. "Look," Robert said, his voice calm but firm. "You don't have time to waste, and neither do they. Let me help, or you'll regret it." For a moment, nobody moved. The mocking and skepticism vanished, leaving only tension in the air. Captain Richards stared at Robert, then glanced at his team, clearly torn. Robert raised a hand, cutting through the silence. "You should think before jumping to conclusions," he said, his tone sharp. "I saw the suspect with chemicals. Just last week, I tried to warn you." Richards folded his arms, his face skeptical. "And why should we believe you?" he asked, dripping with doubt. Robert didn't so much as flinch. "Delta Force Commander, Operation Storm." The words landed like a bomb. The room went dead quiet. Richard's skeptical glare melted into wide-eyed shock. The officers exchanged looks, clearly unsure of what they'd just heard. Richards blinked, the realization dawning on him. "You're kidding," Richards muttered, though his voice wavered. Robert stood tall, calm as ever. "Sector 7, access code 497. "Alpha Charlie," he said, like it was just another fact. The captain hesitated for only a moment before barking into his radio, his voice urgent. The entire group stood motionless as the response crackled back within seconds. Richard's face shifted instantly, shock, then regret. "Sir," Richard said, his voice now full of respect. "I apologize for the misunderstanding." The other officers stared at Robert in stunned silence. He didn't flinch, his face unreadable. "You've got 20 minutes before he sets off the explosives," Robert said calmly. "And it's not just chemicals. I've been watching. There've been electronic components going into that apartment for weeks." Richards didn't hesitate. He immediately barked out orders telling the team to clear the area and secure a perimeter. Amid the chaos, a younger officer lingered, her eyes fixed on Robert. Finally, she stepped forward, her voice steady. "Lieutenant Maya Cruz," she introduced herself. Robert gave her a small nod, his gaze sharp and calculating. Whatever was about to happen, it was obvious this man was no ordinary bystander. The team was about to get a crash course in respect, humility, and just how much they didn't know about the person standing in front of them. Robert moved to the corner, silently observing as tension filled the room. A young officer, clearly nervous but eager, walked up to him. There was a flicker of respect in his expression, something missing in the others. "If you really know this building, we need your help," the officer said, his voice earnest. Robert nodded slightly, taking in the sincerity. "Apartment 402 has a hidden structural flaw," he said, his voice low but firm. "When they built it, there was a mistake in the blueprints. It left a narrow gap between the walls of 402 and 404. You won't find it on any plans, but the only way in is through the ventilation panel in the bathroom of 404. Lieutenant Carter, who'd been glaring at Robert since the beginning, stepped forward with a scoff. "So, let me get this straight," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "We're betting this whole operation on some old guy who claims he's a war hero? This is ridiculous." He shot a look at Captain Richards, barely hiding his disdain. But Robert didn't react. He just stood there, calm and unshaken, as if he'd seen this all before. Richards turned to Carter, his tone calm but firm. "Lieutenant, I just received confirmation from headquarters. This old man is Robert Sinclair, one of the most decorated commanders in Special Forces history. Operation Tempest, 1982. Top secret. If anyone can help us, it's him." Carter's expression twisted with frustration, his resentment boiling over. He might have been someone important decades ago, but that was 40 years ago. Times have changed. Tactics have changed. Alfrec ignored the lieutenant's barbs and focused on Lieutenant Cruz, who was listening intently. He detailed the layout of the building, sharing every bit of critical information. Cruz nodded, quickly piecing together a new plan based on his insights. Carter wasn't ready to let it go. "For all we know, he's making this up. We don't even know if there are explosives." Robert didn't flinch. Calm as ever, he grabbed the analyst's tablet off the table and zoomed in on the live feed of apartment 402. "You've got visual confirmation," he said, pointing to the screen. "You just didn't notice it." The room went quiet. Everyone leaned in closer. On the windowsill of 402, barely visible, sat a small, nondescript device. "That's a motion sensor," Robert explained, his tone steady. "It's hooked to a detonator. Whoever set this up knows exactly what they're doing. Military precision." Lieutenant Cruz stared at the image, her mind racing. Carter, standing off to the side, looked less sure now, his doubt giving way to unease. Meanwhile, Robert stayed laser-focused. He didn't care about proving anything. It wasn't about that. It was about saving lives. "He's right," someone muttered. "How did we miss that?" The team kicked into gear, reworking their plan. Robert, ignoring the buzz around him, eased himself onto a bench. His knee throbbed, a constant reminder of the grenade shard still embedded there from years ago. To most people, he was just an old man. But that ache? It was like a badge, one he didn't need to show. Cruz sat next to him, curiosity flickering across her face. "Why have you never mentioned your past before?" Robert chuckled, a knowing smile tugging at his lips. "Would you believe me? An old black man claiming he used to be a Special Forces commander?" Before Cruz could reply, the radio crackled, The suspect is demanding to speak to someone named Wilson. Says he won't negotiate with anyone else. Every head turned toward Robert. Richards raised an eyebrow. You know this guy? Simon Mercer? Robert said, his voice calm as ever. We served together, a long time ago. Bruce narrowed his eyes, the wheels in his head spinning. You knew he'd call for you, didn't you? Robert didn't reply. He didn't need to. Weeks of quiet observation had led him here. Every odd choice Mercer made, every chemical he sourced, every circuit he built, it all screamed a message only someone like Robert could understand. He'd connected the dots long before anyone else even noticed there was a puzzle. Let me talk to him, Robert said firmly, standing with purpose. The others hesitated, still caught up in their own doubts. To them, Robert was just an aging man in a worn jacket. But what they couldn't see, what they would never fully grasp, was what lay beneath that unassuming exterior. Decades of missions, untold stories, and expertise that didn't need validation. While they debated his credibility, Robert Wilson had already calculated his next moves. In his pocket was a small, neatly folded piece of paper, a quiet plan. Just 5 words, scribbled quickly. Words he hadn't said out loud, not yet. Because Robert wasn't just ready, he was always ahead. Always. 5 words. That's all it would take to flip everything upside down. He adjusted the straps on his bulletproof vest, the weight of the mission pressing down on him. A quick tap to his communicator. Yep, still working. Standard protocol said he should stay behind the barricade. But when Simon Mercer was involved, protocol was out the window. I'm not staying here, Robert muttered, yanking out the earpiece and tossing it aside. Absolutely not, Captain Richards barked, stepping forward. That's against every protocol we have. Robert's voice was calm, steady. Your protocols won't work on Mercer. He's trained to ignore them. Richards frowned. How would you know that? Because I trained him. The air grew heavy, silence thickening around the team. Lieutenant Cruz's eyes widened as she studied Robert. You were his instructor? Robert gave a curt nod. Operation Blackhawk, 1987. I led an elite team for infiltration and extraction. Mercer was my top recruit, until Beirut. Cruz quickly scanned her tablet. There's no record of any operation in Beirut during that time. There wouldn't be, Robert replied, his voice carrying a hint of something darker. Some missions don't make it into the history books. Carter scoffed, crossing his arms. This is insane. We're supposed to trust this guy based on some secret mission that doesn't officially exist? Richards raised a hand, cutting him off. We've verified his identity. If he says he knows Mercer, I believe him. Robert glanced at the clock, then checked his weapon. It wasn't standard issue, but Richards had pulled strings to get it for him after confirming who he was. The firearm felt familiar in his hands, an old ally in a new war. I need 15 minutes, Robert said firmly, leaving no room for debate. If I'm not out with the hostages by then, do what you have to do. The team froze, watching as Robert stepped past the barricade and disappeared into the chaos ahead. Time was running out, and everyone felt the pressure. But Robert? He knew Mercer. That was his edge. He walked toward the towering building, calm and collected, like he had all the time in the world. The police officers nearby just stared, their disbelief written all over their faces. Without a second thought, Robert headed straight for the front door, his confidence almost unnerving. He's walking to his death, Carter muttered, lowering his binoculars, worry etched on his face. No. Cruz said, his voice steady. He's doing what none of us would dare. He knows how to talk to the guy. Inside the dimly lit lobby, Robert advanced with deliberate, measured steps. He didn't bother with cover. He didn't sneak or hesitate. To anyone watching, it looked as though he was simply going to check his mail. Simon, he called out firmly, his voice echoing as he reached the 4th floor. It's me, Wilson. From behind the steel-reinforced door of apartment 402, a gravelly voice responded with hesitation. Commander? Is it... Really you? It's me, Robert replied, his tone calm but authoritative. Open the door. A pause. How do I know this isn't a setup? Robert allowed a faint smile to tug at his lips. Eagle 7? November Alpha. There was silence on the other side, broken only by the clatter of locks turning one by one. Slowly, the door creaked open just wide enough to reveal a disheveled man. Simon Mercer stood there, his once strong frame now gaunt and weary. His graying hair was disheveled, his bloodshot eyes darting with both relief and suspicion. "Commander," Simon breathed, his voice thick with emotion. Without thinking, he snapped into a salute, muscle memory overriding his exhaustion. "We told us you didn't make it." "Almost didn't," Robert said with a faint nod. "Let me in." The door opened wider, and Robert stepped into the small, cluttered apartment. 3 hostages sat tied up on the floor, looking shaken but unharmed. Robert's eyes darted around, taking in every detail. The air felt heavy with tension, but his calm presence seemed to ease it just a bit. "All right," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Let's figure this out." The room was a trap. 2 explosives rigged to the windows, 1 on the back door, and motion sensors covering every entrance. Simon stood rigid, his stress practically radiating off him. "Why, Simon, why all of this?" Robert asked carefully. "They abandoned us, Commander," Simon shot back, his voice raw with anger and hurt. "Beirut, they erased us. Wiped our records clean, left us with nothing, like we didn't even exist." Robert's jaw clenched. He'd heard this story before, but it still hit hard every time. "So you faked your death," he said quietly. Simon nodded, his hand trembling slightly. "Yeah, but the voices, they never stopped." He let out a hollow laugh. "You know what that's like, don't you?" Robert's heart sank. He did know. "Untreated PTSD," he murmured. A soldier cast aside by the very system he swore to protect. Simon studied him, his eyes dark and heavy with bitterness. "It didn't take me long to recognize you, Robert. Commander Wilson, the legend himself. Now just another old guard nobody cares about. They chew us up and spit us out when we're no longer useful." Robert stayed quiet. Outside, the crunch of boots on gravel shattered the silence. The SWAT team was getting into position, weapons ready. Carter, the lead negotiator, turned to Richards with a grim look. "This isn't going anywhere," Carter said. "He's not walking out of this alive. For all we know, he's already dead in there. We need to move in, now." "Inside!" Robert's mind was racing. Time was slipping away, and Simon's chilling words weighed on him. He had to find a way to stop this before it was all over. "We've still got 7 minutes," Cruz pushed, his voice sharp and urgent. "We're not risking more lives for a stubborn old man," Carter snapped back, taking charge of the situation. The tension in the tactical team was almost visible. They were ready to move. Meanwhile, inside the cramped apartment, Robert Wilson sat across from Simon Mercer, trying to keep his cool. The room felt electric with tension as Simon leaned forward, holding onto a small detonator like it was nothing. "They're about to breach," Simon said, calm as ever. He nodded toward the device in his hand. "If they do, we're all dead. I've rigged sensors to every entrance. One wrong move, and this place blows sky high." Robert nodded, his demeanor as serene as a lake at dawn. "I know," he said evenly, "but you've forgotten something I taught you." Simon's brow furrowed. "And what's that?" "Always check for hidden passages." It hit Simon like a bolt of lightning. His face paled as realization dawned. But it was too late. Robert moved with a lethal grace that belied his age. In a heartbeat, Simon was disarmed. The detonator ripped from his grasp. The predator had become the prey. Outside, the SWAT team advanced on the building's main entrance. Carter's voice barked over the radios. "Move in, no delays." "Abort! Abort entry!" Lieutenant Cruz's voice crackled urgently through the comms. "I repeat, abort entry!" Carter's jaw tightened. "We're not stopping now. Keep moving." The squad hesitated, torn between Carter's orders and Cruz's dire warning. Then, 5 chilling words echoed over the radio. "Black Lamb. Abort. Immediately." Those words froze the team in place. Black Lamb was no ordinary code. It was an elite-level emergency signal, reserved for confirmed nuclear or chemical threats, the kind of danger that turned soldiers into statues. "What are you waiting for?" Carter snarled. "Push forward!" One of the operators removed his helmet, his face pale. "Sir, that's Delta Protocol," If it's invoked, we stand down. Before Carter could respond, the front door creaked open. The team's rifles snapped up, but what they saw stopped them cold. Robert Wilson emerged, his movements calm and deliberate. He guided 3 disoriented hostages to safety, their faces riddled with fear but unharmed. Behind him followed Simon Mercer, handcuffed and defeated, his head bowed. The scene was something out of a movie. Just minutes ago, everyone had written Robert off as a frail, stubborn old man. But now? He owned the room. Medics were rushing in to help the hostages as Robert casually handed a detonator and a small notebook to Captain Richards, calm as ever. He didn't even say a word, just turned to face the crowd of stunned officers. The guy they'd all underestimated had just saved the day. Turns out, it wasn't luck. It was 3 weeks of careful planning, enough explosives to blow half a city block. But Simon Mercer didn't need bullets. He needed someone who could outsmart him. Carter stood there, frozen, his usual cocky attitude completely gone, replaced by shock and shame. The man he'd been calling Grandpa had just done what an entire elite task force couldn't. As the red and blue lights from police cars lit up the scene, one thing was clear. The SWAT team, trained and battle-hardened, now looked at Robert Wilson differently. They didn't call him Sir or Mr. Wilson. They called him Commander. The kind of title you don't throw around lightly, one that comes with a ton of respect and untold stories. And oh, did Robert have stories. Decades of secret missions, sacrifices that wouldn't ever make the news. His whole life had been about protecting people who'd never even know his name. The kicker? The system he gave everything for had cast him aside, forgotten and invisible, until a crisis came along that needed the kind of expertise you can't learn from a manual. Robert Wilson wasn't just a man, he was a legend in the making. By morning, Robert Wilson's name was on the front pages of every local newspaper. The headlines read, "Forgotten Hero Saves Hostages." One photo in particular made waves. A 72-year-old black man being honored by the mayor in an impromptu ceremony. The weariness of his years visible but overshadowed by quiet dignity. The same system that had ignored him now stood in the spotlight, facing a storm of backlash. Videos of the incident went viral. Footage of Carter's disrespectful "Hey Grandpa" echoed across social media, turning into a rallying cry against institutional prejudice. The police department was under fire. Carter, the lieutenant who had underestimated Robert, was removed from his role and placed under internal investigation for negligence and misconduct. His authority and ambitions unraveled in a matter of days. But for Robert, the fallout had only just begun. A week later, he received an unexpected call. "Mr. Wilson, this is the National Security Director. We need to talk about your military record." And Simon Mercer. The meeting that followed was tense. Robert found himself sitting in a sterile federal office, surrounded by high-ranking officials. On a screen in front of him, classified documents revealed a chilling truth. Simon Mercer wasn't an isolated case. Dozens of veterans, like Mercer, had been cast aside after covert missions, their records erased, their medical needs ignored. The Beirut incident, the director explained, never officially existed, and neither do you. Robert leaned back, his expression unreadable. "And now you want to fix it because it's all gone public," he said bluntly. "We need your help," the director admitted. "You trained these men. You know their minds, their skills. Some of them could be planning similar actions. We can't afford that." Robert let the silence hang heavy before responding. "I'll help, on one condition. You create a full reintegration and treatment program for these operatives. Official recognition, retroactive medical benefits, all of it. That would cost millions," the director said. "And how many lives will it cost if you don't?" Robert shot back. 3 months later, the Tempest program was born, housed in an unassuming building in the heart of the city. Robert Wilson, now director of operations, personally led efforts to locate and rehabilitate forgotten veterans. Simon Mercer was the program's first participant, receiving treatment instead of a prison sentence. Carter's years of misconduct and discriminatory behavior finally caught up with him after an internal investigation. He was demoted and shipped off to a desk job at a remote rural station. His dreams of leading a department? gone, just like that. One afternoon, Lieutenant Cruz, now one of Robert's closest allies, dropped by his office. "I still don't get it," Cruz said, leaning against the doorframe. "How did you know Mercer would pick that building for his stand?" Robert leaned back in his chair, a smile on his face. "Observation," he said simply. "Sometimes, you just have to really see people." Decades later, Robert Wilson still lived in the same small apartment he'd moved into during his training days. To him, patterns always told a story. You just had to take the time to notice. Cruz, eager to soak up every bit of wisdom, nodded thoughtfully. "The department's changing," Cruz said. "New training protocols to combat bias. They're using your story as part of the curriculum." "It's a start," Robert said with a shrug. "But protocols alone won't do it. You've got to change hearts." 6 months after the incident that had shaken the department to its core, Robert got an honor he'd never expected. The precinct renamed one of its training rooms Wilson Hall, dedicated to teaching observation and pattern recognition. At the ceremony, the new police chief handed him a report that caught him off guard. Police violence incidents had dropped by 40%, and discrimination complaints were down by half since the new protocols were introduced. Robert didn't need a plaque or ceremony to validate his work. But knowing things were finally changing, that was more than enough. "A single voice can change an entire system," the chief declared. "Your silence taught us more than 1,000 motivational speeches ever could." Robert accepted the honor with quiet grace, the same dignity he had shown on that life-altering night. No big speeches, no self-congratulations, just a nod of gratitude. A few days later, while teaching a class of new recruits, Robert noticed someone unexpected in the back row. "Lieutenant Carter," Robert called out, recognizing the disgraced officer who had once been at the center of the crisis that changed everything. Carter, now without his rank or arrogance, looked smaller, humbled. "I requested a transfer to this training," Carter admitted. "I thought it was time I learned to see things more clearly." Robert studied him for a long moment before replying. "Observation starts when you let go of what you think you know. Welcome." That evening, as Robert drove home, he reflected on how crises have a way of revealing true character. Some, like Carter, had to fall hard to learn. Others, like Cruz, simply needed someone to guide them. And while Robert never sought recognition, he knew change was happening. Slowly but surely, in his apartment, a new photograph decorated the wall. It showed Robert receiving a civilian Medal of Honor, standing with 3 hostages who would never know how close they came to losing their lives to prejudice. But the photograph wasn't what mattered most. What mattered were the 5 words now etched as the motto of the department's new training program: "Respect is not a rank." Robert had proven that true strength doesn't come from demanding respect or wielding power. It comes from quiet dignity, unwavering principles, and actions that speak louder than words ever could. His story, one of justice, humility, and transformation, showed that real change starts not with noise, but with the courage to lead by example. If this story inspires you, don't forget to subscribe for more tales of justice, resilience, and the power of doing what's right, even when the world seems set against you.